Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, I want to thank the Society and FPAN in particular for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a really interesting topic. My name is Ben Bilbrey. I'm an archaeologist working for the Tribal Historic Preservation Office with the Seminole Tribe of Florida. And tonight I'm just going to give you an overview of Egmont Key. And I have to apologize in advance because for an island that has only been occupied for less than 200 years, it has an amazing amount of history and archaeology associated with it. So I'm going to try to touch on almost all of it tonight, but since we only have an hour together, I might have to go through it rather fast. So if you have a question or there's a blank spot that I don't address, keep it in mind and hopefully we can address some questions at the end here. So I wanted to start by just looking at Tampa Bay as a whole. When you look at Tampa Bay from space or from the air like this, Egmont Key is completely unimpressive. It's this tiny little tadpole-shaped island right at the mouth of the bay in the lower left of the photo there. It's about 1.7 miles long. It's no more than half a mile wide along its entire width. And it's barely distinguishable from the rest of it, but it does have an amazing amount of history associated with it. So before I get to the history of the archaeology, I did want to talk for just a few minutes about the geology of the island, because it's intensely important when you consider the archaeology of the island, to know what it's made of and how it came to be. If you've ever seen a topographic map in a museum or just looked at a relief map like this online, you might have gotten a look at the Florida continental shelf the way it is here. This is the Florida platform, the colored in area on the map right here. It's almost twice the size of the peninsula itself. It's very, very flat, and the upper levels are made out of carbonate minerals, mainly like limestone, which is calcium carbonate. And that's, in the case of Florida, that's essentially just the carbonate skeletons of billions upon billions of microscopic or small organisms that lived, that died, and their skeletons slowly sank to the bottom of the ocean and began to accumulate. And eventually they grew up into this very large platform. On the east coast, it's not nearly as wide. The peninsula just occupies the east side of the platform. On the west coast, it extends far into the Gulf, maybe more than 100 miles west of Tampa. It's hard to see those colored increments in the upper left, but in the upper half of that key, each one of those colors represents about 10 meters of depth. So it slopes very, very shallowly west from the Tampa Bay area until eventually, when it reaches the Gulf, it drops precipitously down to the Gulf floor, which is about 10,000 feet deep. The upshot of that really shallow slope on the west coast in the Tampa area is that relatively small fluctuations in sea level will cause a big change in where the actual shoreline is, depending on where the sea level is at a given time. The peninsula used to be about twice its current size. Almost the entire surface of the platform was exposed until about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, when the sea level began to rise to its current level. As the sea level rose, topographic highs, small little hills in that limestone, began to be inundated by the sea level and became what are today the barrier islands off the coast of Tampa. On the first slide I showed, you can see them extending north on the west side past the bay there. The vast majority of those have a limestone base to them, just a solid bedrock base that were just small hills on the landscape until the sea level rose. And then once the sea inundated them, they started to accumulate sand to become the barrier islands as we know them today. Most of them, it's a dynamic environment, so some of them are only 100 years old or so, but most of them were formed 2,000 to 4,000 years old and grew from those seeds of limestone. Egmont Key is completely different from that. It's younger. The north central part of the island is made up of a series of sand ridges that's only 1,000 to 1,400 years ago. And the south central is even younger than that, only 300 to 600 years old. And that is crazily young for a geological formation. To get a better idea, when the Great Pyramids were built, Egmont Key didn't exist, at least not in its current form. When Julius Caesar was alive, Egmont Key didn't exist either. It's only around 600 AD that it grew into its beginning up to go to approximate its current form. And it has no limestone bedrock underneath it. It's just made out of a series of sand ridges that built up through the tidal currents around Tampa Bay. So, why does this geology matter? It matters for a couple different reasons. First of all, when it comes to the archaeology, context is everything. When we're typically working on an archaeological site, the depth we find a given artifact at, the distribution of artifacts across the site, all of that is tremendously important. It can tell us the intensity of occupation at a site, depending on how dense the artifacts we find are. It can tell us the relative dating at a site. If something, if your stratigraphy is intact, the older an artifact is, generally the deeper we will find it. If you have no solid bedrock on a given island, like Egmont Key, and the sand that makes up the island is constantly being churned around, that can ruin your context, or at the very least disrupt it to the extent that it's more difficult to figure out what's going on in a site. And secondly, for the future of the island, the shape of the island is highly dependent on the currents flowing in and out of Tampa Bay. Immediately to the north of the island is the Egmont Channel, which is the main shipping channel going in and out of Tampa Bay. And to the south of the island is the Southwest Channel, which is an additional channel going in and out of the bay. With no limestone to anchor anything, and with the currents moving all around the way they are, the island, as we will see, will wax and wane tremendously as time goes on. Now, for some of the same reasons I just mentioned, for most of its history, Egmont Key was entirely unoccupied. There were indigenous peoples in the area and throughout the Tampa Bay area, but because there was no fresh water source on the island, there was no long-term food supply that could sustain a permanent occupation. There was no permanent occupation. It was sometimes used for a fishing spot, or sometimes used as perhaps a short-term campsite, but there's no hard evidence whatsoever of any kind of long-term occupation. The first image we have on the island on any sort of historic map was drawn by a Spanish mariner named Don Francisco Maria Celi in 1757. They sailed into Tampa Bay, they drew a map. This particular map is, we're looking east from the bay. So north is at the west, and Egmont Key itself is in the bottom right of the map, the oval-shaped island there. Celi named the island San Blas y Barrera after his superior officer stationed in Cuba. It doesn't hurt to score a few points. And here's the map rotated to the north so that you can kind of get a perspective on Tampa Bay that we're all most familiar with. The island is in the lower left here, but it's a little small. Oh, really? Right. It's right about right here on the north. He actually did land on the island and was able to map it out to a pretty good degree. He just had a marked rope and a compass, and he measured the island in Castilian yards, which were 33 inches in length as opposed to our modern 36. He started at the south coast, worked his way around counterclockwise, and when he got back to the south, he erected a giant cross on the southern shore and then sailed away. And that was, in his logbooks, he mentions being able to see it for a good way as he headed south from Tampa Bay. That was in 1757, and in 1763, only 6 years later, Florida became British instead of Spanish. In 1763, the 7 Years' War ended in Europe, and the British had captured Havana, which was an important Spanish port in the Caribbean, and the Spanish considered Havana to be a lot more important than Florida was, so they traded Florida to the British in return for getting Havana back from them. And as soon as they got it, that island, which Sully had named for his boss, was renamed Egmont Key after the John Percival, who was the second Earl of Egmont and the first Lord of the Admiralty at the time in Great Britain. Egmont, the word, is actually a location in Ireland. And the title Earl of Egmont still existed until just 2011, and I think the 12th Earl of Egmont died that year without heirs, so there is no longer an Earl of Egmont. Now, anybody who's been out to Egmont Key will probably have seen the ruins of Fort Dayton, which is out there. But before any of Fort Dayton was constructed, most of the Seminole Wars were fought in Florida. Now, this was a long period lasting decades in the 19th century, during which the Seminoles were pressured and provoked, and in an effort by the United States to displace or move them west to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. The terminology associated with the Seminole Wars is a really good indication, actually, of the different ways the wars were viewed by both the United States and the Seminoles in general. If you read about them on Wikipedia or a typical history book, the Seminole Wars are typically divided into the first, the second, and the third Seminole Wars. Just because this is the way the United States typically viewed conflict. The Western way of looking at conflict is you have hot wars that are bracketed by distinct events. You have an inciting incident or an outbreak that is able to be defined as the start of a war. You prosecute the war by going after the enemy. You fight a certain number of battles, and then eventually you defeat your enemy, or you achieve the goals that you've set out to do. And the wars can either end by having a treaty, or they can end by just the inciting incident going away. But the big thing is that they have distinct starting points and conclusions. From the Seminole perspective, this whole period between around 1816 and 1858 was a long period of just pressure and provocation for different reasons. There were a couple treaties along the way. In 1823, they had the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which the Seminoles agreed to be confined to a reservation in the central part of the state, around where Orlando is today. And in return, they would refrain from going to the east to the west coast. That was in 1823, but then in 1830, the administration of Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, in which whatever indigenous tribes were remaining in the east would be removed and sent off to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Most of the Seminoles refused to move, and that was part of the reason for beginning the Second Seminole War in 1835. Following that conflict, they got a new reservation further south in the state, away from the areas that the United States wanted to settle, near where the Everglades are nowadays. And then the Third Seminole War was incited by the fact that American settlers were moving further south, and they wanted some of the land that had been given to the Seminoles after the Second World War. And in an effort to provoke them, they kept settling closer and closer to the Seminole boundaries. The United States kept sending expeditions into the reservation area and establishing small outposts until eventually the Seminoles fought back in 1855. And by the time of 1858, most of the Seminoles remaining in Florida had been captured and interned and shipped off to Oklahoma. There were only a few hundred survivors who retreated into the Everglades and are the ancestors of the Seminole tribe who are still alive today. As this whole process was going on, as settlers moved further south into Florida and the military moved south into Florida, and as the United States got more and more involved with international affairs and considered the need for coastal defense, they examined the coast of Florida to look at defensible areas or ports that needed defending or would be important in time of war. And almost immediately, Egmont Key was recognized as a strategic location. It's right there at the mouth of Tampa Bay, right in between the two main channels that are heading in. So it was considered of importance to control the Bay Area if that ever became necessary. First up, though, it was also a good location for a lighthouse. So the very first lighthouse constructed on Egmont Key was completed in 1848. It was completed earlier in the year, and then almost immediately was just ravaged by a hurricane that came in. The hurricane of 1848 was one of two known occasions in which the island was just completely submerged underwater by the storm surge. Storm surge was anywhere between 10 and 15 feet during the hurricane of 1848. The island doesn't get that high above water, so it was just completely flooded. There's a story of the lighthouse keeper at the time, a guy named Marvel Edwards, which is an amazing name, riding out the hurricane with his family in a rowboat that he just tied to a palm tree on the island. And supposedly the end of the rope was found 9 feet above the ground when they were rescued the following day, and then he went to the mainland and quit immediately. Which I don't think I can complain for that. The lighthouse wasn't completely destroyed by the hurricane, but they did try to repair it periodically, but it was so decrepit following that it was soon demolished, and a second lighthouse was built. That one was completed in 1858, and that's the lighthouse that is still out there to this day. It's a good 160 plus years old. So, because the lighthouse was there, and because it was a strategic location, and you had a pier on the island that could be used to bring supplies in and out, during that Third Seminole War, that last war, the Army had a need of keeping Seminole prisoners of war. So the decision was made in 1857. They established a prison camp on the island. It was just south of the actual location of the lighthouse. We don't know. Sorry about that, guys. I have no idea how that happened. Oh, is that why? Okay. Well, we don't know for sure that the actual stockade where the prisoners were kept looked like this. There's circumstantial evidence that the Army had regulations as to what kind of fortifications should be built in a given environment. Looks similar to this, a wooden stockade with bastions at either end. It was able to be constructed with the materials they had on hand. You have the trees that are out at Egmont Key nowadays, palms, but a sailor that landed on the island in the 1840s also noted that red cedar and live oak were out there as well, so those may have been available too. And then as an additional piece of corroborating evidence, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office has also found the ruins of Fort Shackelford, which is a Third Seminole War fort constructed 2 years before in 1855. We haven't excavated all of it yet, but the construction details we have found are consistent with something like this, just a wooden stockade. So terminology comes into play again here. Over the course of those last 2 years of the Seminole War, we had hundreds of captured Seminole being held on Egmont Key. Most of them were women and children. Some of them were older men and women captured while the warriors were away from the camps. Sometimes the United States would use them as leverage to force the surrender of other warriors. It's referred to in the Army records as an Indian depot, but by every definition of the word, it is a concentration camp in the sense that it was holding combatants or non-combatants without trial and who were considered politically undesirable by the government. Billy Bowlegs was the most prominent leader of the Seminoles throughout the 1850s during this Third War period. He was held at Egmont Key himself. He eventually called for a truce to end the war in 1858, and his band, though not all of the Seminoles, agreed to be transported to Oklahoma. Here's an announcement in the New York Herald regarding the end of the Florida War, as they call it. And it's a list of Seminole that are about to be transported to Oklahoma aboard a steamship called the Gray Cloud. And this is Polly Parker. She has an amazing story. She led the only successful escape of prisoners who were held at Egmont Key. She went on board the Gray Cloud, and then as they sailed north through the Gulf, the Gray Cloud stopped to pick up lumber in the Florida Panhandle near where the Apalachicola River is. And she and her followers were able to escape the ship and go on this long overland odyssey all the way down to Lake Okeechobee and eventually hook up with the remainder of the Seminoles that were down there. And the Seminoles that wouldn't go with Billy Bowlegs were led by Sam Jones. And this group as a whole, only a few hundred people in total, are the ancestors of the Seminole tribe of Florida today. A tribal historian in the 1950s determined that there were over 200 descendants of Polly Parker remaining, which were fully 20% of the tribal members who were alive at that time. It's the difference one person can make. And she lived to be over 100, like passing away near Okeechobee in 1921. Now, as for the location of the prison camp on the island, we haven't discovered any archaeological evidence of it yet. It was most likely located near the lighthouse, probably to the south of the lighthouse, because the remainder of the island for Fort Dade hadn't been developed yet at this point. And there was a natural clearing in this location just south of the lighthouse and the cemetery. It's where a helipad was in place during the 1970s. It's no longer in use, but because it was located in a natural clearing in the center of the island, it would have made the best location for it. Whether the helicopter pad overlaps it or not could be a good thing or a bad thing. It's possible the construction would have destroyed any of the good archaeology that was there. It's also possible that it could have protected any archaeological deposits that are there from any further erosion that had happened since that point, but it's only been covered since the 70s, so it did have more than a century of unrestrained erosion if it is there. It just remains to be seen. Now, once the Civil War broke out in 1861, Egmont Key was a good base for Confederate blankets. blockade runners, or it would have been a good base for Confederate blockade runners if it was not captured by the Union almost immediately as soon as the war started. It was captured in July of 1861, and there is a story of the lighthouse keeper at the time, who was a Confederate sympathizer, taking the lens assembly from the lighthouse and bringing it to shore so that the Union couldn't use it. They did install a different light on top, but it wasn't as powerful as the original one, and the Union Navy was just able to use the island as a naval station and as a safe haven for Union loyalists escaping Tampa throughout the remainder of the war. So even though it was used periodically during the Civil War, in 1898 the Spanish-American War broke out. And given Florida's proximity to Cuba, this was the spark that eventually resulted in major fortifications being constructed on the island. Fort Dade was built to defend Tampa Bay along with Fort DeSoto, which is on the north side of the channel, closer to the mainland. Had multiple artillery batteries that were used to defend the channel, and also support buildings for the fort were constructed over most of the land area of the island. It drastically changed the landscape. In this case, the main batteries were built up here. There's 3 of them. Let me flip over to my other map. Battery Mellon, Battery Howard, Battery McIntosh were all outfitted with so-called disappearing guns, which were mounted to a carriage that would raise them above the parapet to fire, and then the recoil from the firing would drive them back down below the parapet to be reloaded so that the gun crews would be exposed to fire. There were 2 additional batteries called John Page and Berkstead on the south end of the island. These 3 you can still visit nowadays. These 2, since the island has been eroding, are now completely off the south shore of the island. That previous slide I popped up about why the geology is important. Those are those 2 flooded batteries off the south side of the island right there. There are pictures on Google of people driving their boats up to them and kind of taking photos, but I've never actually been out there. So. The area in between the 2 batteries here was full of support structures associated with Fort Dade. You see some of those in the upper left here. This one in the upper right is the married officers' quarters. There were also a bachelor officers' quarters. They had a gymnasium, they had a bowling alley, they had a movie theater. It was never a walled fort, like your traditional conception of a fort. Like if you've ever been down to Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, that giant brick fort, it was never meant to actually defend against a siege that way. It was just meant to deny ships the ability to traverse the channel into Tampa Bay without any kind of resistance whatsoever. Fort Dade, the construction of Fort Dade began around 1900. It wasn't like actively used during the Spanish-American War at all because construction took too long and it was an extraordinarily short war to begin with. But construction began around 1900. The fort was used during most of the World War I period. Returning soldiers from the Spanish-American War were quarantined there briefly as a measure against yellow fever. And but despite all the effort that was put into constructing it, including a big power plant in the center of the island, by 1921 it was completely abandoned, and it was just the responsibility of a single caretaker by 1923 or so. There was an old cemetery on the island. Some of the lighthouse keepers were there. There was what was called an Italian laborer who drowned in 1891. You can see his name listed right there, a coal tender for the lighthouse. Lighthouse keeper family. There were a few people in a lighthouse tender, people who died during the Spanish-American War quarantine camp, but this old cemetery was investigated once Fort Dade was constructed, and was found to be in a really dilapidated condition, so the bodies were removed to other locations. 4 or 5 of the burials there were Seminoles who were detained on Egmont Key. For a while, it was unclear where their bodies actually ended up. The records we had initially, we indicated what would happen to the American military and civilians, but it was unsure where the Indian remains were at first, until records of the St. Augustine National Cemetery revealed that they were actually buried there. These are the actual records right here. They were just listed as unknown Indian prisoners. And eventually, we were able to find the burials in 2 separate plots on the St. Augustine. This is hard to see, but it just says 6 unknown Indians. So we don't know their names, but we just know they ended up there somehow in the 3rd Seminole War, and their bodies wound up here in St. Augustine. And since it has become a state park and a bird sanctuary, it still is to this day. As for the archaeology on the island, there was a survey conducted in 2006 by a company called Pan American Consultants. This was concentrated on just looking at the transportation network of Fort Dayton, because there are concrete and brick roads running throughout the entire island that are still walkable to this day. Most of the buildings are in ruins. There are only a couple buildings that are even recognizable nowadays. The guardhouse is still in excellent condition and maintained. But for most of the fort, most of the support buildings we saw in the photos earlier, just the roads showing where they were close to. This 2006 survey excavated 5 different test units along different portions of the road. Their purpose was to both examine the construction techniques of the road and also to determine whether artifacts were present associated with the buildings that were nearby. For example, one test unit was excavated near the bakery, another was excavated near the gymnasium, and they wanted to see if archaeological context remained that would allow us to determine what buildings that were there if we didn't have the records to indicate that. On the right is one of the test units. You can see it's along the side of one of these roads. You can see a little bit of curb right here. This was probably a previously excavated construction trench for the road, and then this is intact soil right here. They did find artifacts that were associated with the structures they were built near, and that's a really important find right there. They found metal objects near the bakery that may have been used for container closures. Near the gymnasium, which had become a firing range later in the fort's history, they did find a great many rifle cartridges and a few bullets. The only test unit out of the 5 where they found firearm materials, which makes sense given what the building was used for. And if you recall what I said earlier about the island kind of being vulnerable to getting its context messed up, this may be a significant find in the sense that this is demonstrable, almost 100-year material that is still intact, or at least intact to the extent that it's relevant to what the buildings were nearby, and we can tell. However, this was all in the southern Fort Dayton portion of the island. It didn't approach the Seminole areas in the north, so it doesn't for sure tell us anything about the context in those areas. So in 2016, there was a wildfire on Egmont Key. Here's an aerial view of it. In the other one, there is here's a shot right here. A lightning bolt started it, and it actually went on for 3 days or so before firefighters were able to put it out. But it actually did give us a unique opportunity once it was finally put out. The island is dense. It's got loads of plants there, and it can be difficult to make your way through the undergrowth if you're trying to dig in a particular area. we might not, even if we could, we might not want to just machete through, you know, what is a wildlife sanctuary to try to excavate shovel tests. So this gave us an opportunity to do some investigations without damaging the key any further. Yeah, burned 79 acres total. Here's the burned area afterward. It was an environmental threat to the island, as I mentioned, but all of that undergrowth is gone. Surface visibility is excellent, and you couldn't ask for an area to excavate that looked much better than this. Now we unfortunately didn't have the time to do a full phase 1 excavation here. That would be digging shovel test holes about this wide. Every given interval, usually if it's a high probability area, we dig a shovel test every 20 meters or 63 feet or so. We didn't have time to systematically do that on Egmont Key, but we were able to metal detect. You can see something with a metal detector right there. Oops, that's not bad. So we've got a metal detector right there, and then when we get a hit off the metal detector, someone will come along with a shovel test and excavate it until we find the relevant artifact. That obviously doesn't allow us to find non-metallic artifacts, but excavations throughout the country on military sites, primarily on battlefields, but also on fort sites like on Fort Dade, indicate that on military sites, metal artifacts are by far the most common artifacts that are usually recovered. So metal detectors are great on these type of sites. If there wasn't a person immediately nearby with a shovel test, you'd pop a pin flag on the ground right there, and eventually the shovel person would come along, and we would take a GPS point. We found a series of, we found a small number of artifacts that we hope date from the time of the Seminole internment. That was a big find on the island because it was the first distinct indication of a occupation that predated the Fort Dade era. And we found a belt buckle, we found a double-headed rivet that had hand-hammered marks on both of its sides, which were dated to the first half of the 19th century. And we found a couple of different mini balls. This is a Williams cleaner round, which is a type of mini ball that had a tip of a bullet, but it also had this plug behind it that was on a little stem, and that's part of the stem right there. Purpose of that round was to kind of remove the fouling from a musket barrel when you fire it. These were black powder weapons, and you can only fire a handful of rounds before that stuff starts building up on the inside of the barrel, and you can't even ram your bullet down into the barrel anymore. So they had these cleaner rounds, and soldiers hated them because they didn't work very well. But we did find one here on the key. So Egmont Key is disappearing. There's a couple different reasons for that, but between 1877 and 2019, the land area of the island has shrunk from around 580 acres to roughly 200 acres, which is a loss of more than 60%. 1877 is actually recorded, it's the largest recorded size the island ever got. It actually got even bigger for a little bit. At the time, study surveyed it in 1757 and 1877, but since then, it's been shrinking. But the big thing is that it's not shrinking at a steady rate. Because of that lack of limestone substrate again, it's affected by the velocity of tidal currents in the channels north and south of the island. Those channels have been dredged, and we actually saw two major periods of accelerated loss of land from 1978 to 1984 and 1999 to 2002. And both of those coincidentally happened to be periods when the channel was being redredged or deepened. So it's most likely that the when the channel gets deepened, the tidal currents going in and out of the bay increase in velocity because they aren't as obstructed as they were before. And that causes additional sand to be carried away from the bay. Because of that, and those, in addition to the lack of the limestone, those channel currents are right there to the north and south of the island. It's not the case for any other barrier island, so it's kind of a perfect storm here. Artificial beach nourishment has mitigated that somewhat. There was a projection that if the beaches had not been refurbished in any way whatsoever, the island would have completely disappeared by the year 2050 or 2060. It's probably going to be delayed somewhat, as long as the beach keeps getting replenished, but these are processes that aren't really going to go away. The shipping channels aren't going to be filled in or anything like that, so this is a process that might not ever stop. So that makes it all the more important to investigate the island while it's still here. A couple of aerial photos here. It's hard to see where the Fort Dade buildings were. Most of them were gone by 1942, but the lighthouse is up here. Most of the buildings were in this area. The power plant was in the center of the island, and that was constructed in 1919 or so, but that is in the surf now because this entire half of the island is pretty much gone by 2009. You see it actually built up a little bit on the southern end here, and that's visible in the tree line. Like, these are more established trees, and this is just scrub vegetation to attach to that relatively recent sand down here. So it's a really dynamic environment. It's not all, it's going down overall, but it is building up in unique areas too as the given situation changes. Here's a picture of the power plant right there. Again, that used to be in the center of the island, but now it's completely collapsed and in the surf. View of Egmont Key shrinking over time. So, all of those factors shrinking the key are also exacerbated by climate change and sea level rise as well. The current has affected the island for all of its existence, most likely, but the sea level rise has only happened in the last few decades, and it's only going to be exacerbating the existing problems you have. So last year, now, the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation has actually listed Egmont Key as one of the most threatened historic properties in the state. It's actually the first property to be listed just due to the threat of sea level rise and other global change. So what are some possibilities for the future here? We're back. Okay. A couple of things we have looked at are artifact tracking experiments. We're still in the relatively early stages here, but if we can find, this wouldn't work for very, very small artifacts because those are moving around all the time. If you ever take a trip to Egmont Key and look at the soil is just full of tiny, tiny little brick fragments and sometimes glass fragments from the fort. They're just everywhere on the island. On the surface, erosion has completely stirred up the area, but larger artifacts may migrate in a more predictable pattern, or a pattern that can be studied in order to see if we can kind of retroactively reconstruct any kind of context that was there and that was then lost. So the idea is to potentially put trackers on artifacts and see how they move over time, and see if we can construct a more complete picture of the dynamics that are moving things around on the island. Additional excavation and archival research is a possibility as well. There are records in the National Archives, there are records in Jacksonville that are just monumental, and we would like to search those for every reference to Egmont Key that we can find to get a more complete picture of the history of the island. We've been able to do some of that, but there remains work to be done in those areas as well. And just continued education, stuff like this. The Seminole story at Egmont Key is a really interesting one, and the story is getting out there, but there remains a lot of additional talks we can do in this area. In addition to talking to the public, we've actually brought Seminole elders and other tribal members to the island. This is in one of the batteries in Fort Dade, but it's tremendously powerful to see people like this examining the island, because these are the direct descendants of people like Polly Parker. And this is such a traumatic event in their history that we can only study more about it and try to learn more about it. It's important to consider what a close thing this was for the Seminoles. Just a few hundred people remained in Florida after the Third Seminole War. If not for people like Polly Parker, who escaped, that could have been it. They moved into Florida, they established their own culture that was connected to the environment of Florida, and this was almost the end right here on Egmont Key. But because of the efforts of Polly Parker and other people, it wasn't. And today they have the ability to go to the island and learn more about their history. But we don't know how much longer the island's going to be there. So it looks like we have a few minutes left. Can I answer anybody's questions? Areas that we didn't touch on or you'd like to learn more about today? Yeah.
It was my understanding that quite a few Seminoles passed away, more than 6. I understood that they were buried in other words, they were males of some type of statue that were buried in that, from White Cemetery, that there's actually a lost Seminole cemetery somewhere on the island where many more people are buried.
Well, by all means. Our archives and the records we have are beyond fragmentary. Those 6 were listed because we knew they were there, and we were able to establish their existence in the St. Augustine Cemetery and the Egmont Key Cemetery. Prison camps being what they are, the prisoners were the least important people in the camp, so they didn't necessarily keep the best records of who was buried on the island and where. So, by all means, there could be remains still on the island. Anyone else? Yes?
During World War II, weren't there bombing ranges? I think my father flew from McGill with C-47s, C-51s, and they bombed. They built up bulkheads along the beaches, and that's where they strafed and bombed.
Right, exactly. And I didn't mention all the facilities that were there in Fort Dade either. Like there was a mine wharf on the north side of the island. During World War II, they placed searchlights on top of the batteries. There was even a U-boat sunk, not by Egmont Key, but just a few dozen miles southwest of there. A U-boat was sunk in the bay during the war, and that's been divers have been down to that and examined it as well. But yeah. Yes.
The picture you had right before this one, was that the Seminole Indians that came to check out the island?
Oh, yes. All of these photos are tribal members from here.
I guess, yeah, it was the one you just skipped. I guess, well, you can't really see it now, but...
This one right here?
Yeah. So,
yep. This was, again, during the elders' visit, and these are descendants of Polly Parker, who were actually able to come back 150 years after she was there. And,
yeah, I'm glad to see that picture. That kind of gives me an idea,
it's kind of the tactile family history. You don't have a lot of opportunities to experience usually. Yes.
Would you be able to go back to the aerial photos and show us
Sure.
approximately where you think the internment camp was and
Sure,
where
the,
fire was?
Oh, sure, the aerial photo showing the island shrinking, or any
Yes.
one of those? Okay.
Yeah, that one.
Okay. Yeah. The all of Fort Dade is the south part of the island. The lighthouse is up here. The cemetery as it exists now is immediately south of that. Actually, let's look at the December 9 photos. Actually, 2009 actually has this is the clearing that has the lighthouse in it, right here. The cemetery is immediately south of that, like right here, and then this is the clearing that has the helipad right here. So we're thinking it was somewhere near there, because that was the only developed part of the island at the time. Like there was a pier for supplies to go to the lighthouse, but other than that, this was all undeveloped. And then the fire was in this area right here.
Okay. Were you able to use like ground penetrating radar or any other things similar to that?
We did try doing ground penetrating radar, yeah, but the salt crystals in the ground just messed up the returns.
Okay.
Because calcium chloride makes distinct crystals, and the geometry of those crystals are random when they're in the ground, and that just scatters the signal all over the place, and you can get returns back. Yeah. Yes.
Was there any indication of where their trash dump may have been?
The fort's trash dump?
Yeah.
Or the fort actually was a pretty it was a highly developed area, I guess you'd call it. Like they had railroads to move the length of the island, and they actually had a whole facility for taking care of their trash. Like it wasn't a specific dump. I believe it was transported off the island. Yeah.
Can they determine how old the trees are?
I haven't seen any studies about how long trees have been there, or how old the
Exactly.
specific trees are.
Yeah.
Has to be. I imagine they would have been. The island would have been colonized by plant life like relatively soon after it was formed, so around 1,400 years ago. Plants are very, very good at transporting their spores over long distance, either on like logs that washed ashore or just on the breeze. So, but yeah. Yeah.
When you were talking about the Florida shelf, does that mean that the west coast of Florida is more susceptible to sea level rise than the east coast?
As it is now, probably no more susceptible. Like if the sea level dropped, you'd get a lot more real estate opening up on the west coast than you would on the east coast. But as it is today, like all of Florida is extremely low elevation. So as it rises further, I think both coasts would get it similarly. Yeah.
It's surprising there haven't been more fires on the island.
That is surprising. Yeah.
And I wonder about the management of the island. Are prescribed burns used at all, or is there too much stuff on the island that could be threatened by that?
Do you have information on that?
Yeah, the Fish and Wildlife Service always applies to do prescribed burns, but they don't get the money authorized. So they constantly ask.
Oh,
But
really?
they don't get approved to do it.
Huh.
So they were kind of happy about the burn because it allowed the
You cleared up a lot of that understory that
Because
they
I noticed it burned everything down to the sand. And
Yeah.
typically a natural fire, first of all, there wouldn't be that much stuff to burn because other fires would have taken some of it out pretty quickly.
Sure.
So that it seemed like there was an excess of fuel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm surprised that
pretty good though.
I am kind of surprised that we haven't had more natural fires in the recorded history. I know in the 20s some of the buildings in Fort Dade got burned down, but I haven't seen any references to that spreading to the tree-covered areas of the island at all. Yes.
Is there an intent to excavate the helipad?
I haven't heard any concrete plans. But yeah, it would be very interesting to, but I don't know of any existing plans right now. Anybody else?
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.